Okay, on to part two, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the presidency exactly. And so we're going to talk about qualifications for office. So these are found in the Constitution. The Constitution says what you have to be in order to run for president. So first off, you have to be 35 years old. You have to be a resident of the U.S. for the last 14 years, meaning you have to have lived here for the past 14 years. You have to be a natural-born citizen of the United States, or a citizen at the time of adoption of the Constitution. So, first off, let's talk. These are fairly limited. There's a whole lot of people who qualify for this, and we talked a little bit about this when we talked about the legislature. There's a whole lot of people who are qualified to run for president of the U.S. that we would rather not have run for president of the U.S. For example, I'm qualified. I am 37 years old. I was born here, and I've been a resident for my entire life. So that's all it takes to run for president of the United States. That's not much. And that's important. That's on purpose. The Founding Fathers wanted to leave the question of who should be allowed to become president up to the voters. They didn't want to have some arcane test. Now, it's important to realize these are the qualifications put up by the Constitution, and the courts have told us that any additional qualifications are very likely unconstitutional. So what does that mean? Well, what if the state of Florida decides that in order to run for president, you have to release your tax returns? This has been a major issue with Donald Trump. In fact, a number of states tried to do this. When it became time for primaries to run around again, a number of states like California passed new laws saying in order to get on the ballot to run for president, to be in the primary, to choose who the president for the Republican Party will be, you have to release your tax returns. Because President Trump has famously refused to do so. First time since Nixon, a president has refused to do so. And so they tried to do that, and the court struck that down. Why did the court strike it down? They said the Constitution spells out what the qualifications are, and you cannot add any additional requirements to this, because that would be basically amending the Constitution. Now, they have given some leeway. The courts have said, we can do certain things to make sure that putting the person on the ballot, administrative costs are covered, things like that. So if you want to run for president, you normally will have to pay a certain fee to the state, relatively minor fee for somebody running for president, still several thousands of dollars, but relatively minor if you're looking at doing a presidential campaign. Or you have to get a certain number of signatures. People in the community have to sign and say, we want this person to be on the ballot. And the courts have said that's okay. That's dealing with administrative issues. That's not actually adding qualifications. That's just taking care of the paperwork side. They also have to fill out an application. The Constitution doesn't say in order to run for president you have to fill out an application. But the states can say you have to fill out an application. You have to give them your name, your address, all of that stuff. So the courts have said, yeah, it's okay to have some qualifications for office that are dealing with sort of the administrative side, but you can't add to these qualifications for office without, in essence, amending the Constitution. So no, California can't require someone running for president to release their tax returns. So either constitutional amendment or voluntary. Now, this national-born citizen or citizen at time of adoption of the Constitution, now, of course, citizen at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, that's not relevant anymore. No one is alive anymore that was a citizen at the time the Constitution was adopted. Natural-born citizen is a more interesting one, and it does, in fact, come up quite frequently. When our country was founded, there was a legitimate fear that we would basically be taken over by a foreign power. And one of the ways the Founding Fathers envisioned our country being taken over by a foreign power was literally some king runs for president. You just have the king of France say, oh, well, put me on the ballot. And if he's able to win, does that mean we become part of France, or even just a French citizen, somebody sympathetic to it? Gets paid by the president, the king of France, to come over to the U.S., run for president. He wins it, and then just does whatever France tells him to. So, what is a natural-born citizen? Well, the Constitution doesn't actually define what a natural-born citizen is. Most people who look at it agree that it means if you were born in the United States. Most people say, yeah, that means you're a natural-born citizen. You were born here in the U.S. There's a bigger question, but we believe, yes, also, if you were qualified to be a citizen at the time of your birth. So what that means, for example, if your parents were U.S. citizens and they were on vacation in France when you were born. Well, when you were born under U.S. law, you were a U.S. citizen because your parents were U.S. citizens, even though you were born in France. So most people agree that that also qualifies, but it's honestly not 100% clear. And there's a number of sort of corner cases that come up. Like, for example, John McCain. John McCain ran for president on the Republican Party not too long ago. It was Obama's first, when he was first running for election, the Republican candidate was John McCain. John McCain, so first off, Obama was a U.S. citizen. He was born in Hawaii, and his mother was a U.S. citizen. No question, Obama's in. He is a U.S. citizen. But his opponent, and this is interesting because when all of this birther stuff was going on, his opponent, John McCain, well, there is actually something of a legitimate question. See, he was born in 1936 at Coco Solo Naval Air Station in the Panama Canal Zone. Both of his parents were U.S. citizens, but the Panama Canal Zone was not U.S. territory at the time he was born. So that meant that he was not born on U.S. soil. So was he a citizen at the time of birth? Now, most people say yes, because his parents were citizens. However, some people say you actually have to be born in the U.S. So there was a little bit of a question on that. It wasn't really brought up. I'm sure many of you can guess why Obama's citizenship was questioned, even though there wasn't a legitimate question, whereas John McCain's never was, and there was potentially a question. But John McCain was not really questioned. What about Ted Cruz? Our local senator ran for president last time. I think the time before that again. Will probably run next time around. So he's been around. He was born in Canada. That's right. Ted Cruz, our very, very Texan, is actually a Canadian. He claimed when this came out that he didn't actually know that he had dual citizenship. Because he was born in Canada, he was a dual citizen of Canada and the U.S. His mother was a U.S. citizen, but his father was Cuban. So he was a citizen of Canada and of the U.S. when he ran for president. He found out about it and renounced his Canadian citizenship so there wouldn't be any questions. But that came up because he is very much runs as this sort of very Texan person. He doesn't talk much about the fact that he is Hispanic. His father was Cuban. He doesn't talk much about that. In fact, he goes by Ted instead of his actual given name. And he was born in Canada. But we agreed that he was a natural-born citizen, or at least he didn't get far enough in the process for it to be challenged. What about Arnold Schwarzenegger? I love Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's an interesting figure. He was born in Austria. From the time he was 10, he dreamed of living in the U.S. He moved here at 21 with nothing, became famous first as a bodybuilder, then became a movie star. He rose up, became a national icon, ultimately became governor of California for 2 terms. Can he run for president of the United States? Hopefully most of you are saying, no, he cannot. Why not? Well, because he was born in Austria, despite the fact that he has been here for his adult life, that he has served as a governor, that he has been a major figure in U.S. history, that there's not really a question that Arnold is about as American as anyone can be. He is not allowed to take that step and run for the highest elected office in the land. Now, why not? Are we actually afraid Austria is going to take over the U.S. if Arnold is allowed to take over? Are we afraid that he's going to negatively influence, if he's allowed to run for president and is chosen by the people, that he will somehow negatively influence our political process? The answer is no, of course not. So this brings up a quick question, just something for you to think about. Should Arnold Schwarzenegger be allowed to run for president? Should we amend the Constitution? Does it still make sense to say that people have to be born here to run for president, or have the great number of recent immigrants who have become senators, congressmen, important political figures, has this shown that that idea is outdated? Just something to think about. Because remember, one of the goals in this course is to get you to think about your government, not just accept what the rules are. Okay, very briefly, we're going to hit this last section because it's small, and then we'll have one more short video after this. But the growth of power in the presidency. So we have to remember that originally Congress was in charge. The president just carried out their acts. The first presidents were, even though Washington was an extraordinary figure in history, they understood their position to be administrators. In 1828, we saw Andrew Jackson was elected, and he was different. He created the modern political party. He created the modern Democratic Party. He went out, and instead of, before that, the presidents were regionally elected. Federalists versus Democrat Republicans. Federalists in the north, Democrat Republicans in the south, and Whigs. I mean, it was regional parties. Andrew Jackson viewed this differently. He said, I am the voice of the people. And so he went out and campaigned actively with all the people, shaking hands, kissing babies. And he believed that the president's role was to be more active, more in control, because he said, I am the only person elected by the entire country. Senators are elected by states. House members are elected by districts. The president is elected by the people, and he should be the people's voice. So he took this very active role, but most of the later presidents after him through the 19th century didn't follow his example. They followed, and this is the word to take away from it, they followed the Whig theory of the presidency. The Whig theory, when we think about Whigs, whenever I hear it, I think about powdered wigs like the old politicians used to wear, and you kind of think, oh, stuffy old person, right? But in reality, the Whig Party was borrowed from England, and it was the party that believed in a limited presidency. They believed in more powers for the people. And so the Whig theory is a theory of governance which has a weak executive, the president as an administrator. The president's opinion on law doesn't matter. His job is to carry out the laws that Congress creates. So we saw most of the early presidents followed this Whig theory. They were elected, their job was to be an administrator of the laws, but not to impose their own opinions on the law. Then Teddy Roosevelt came about, 1901. Very active, robust figure, larger-than-life figure in American history. And there's few people you can imagine who would less embody the ability to be sort of a Whig president. He believed in a strong president. We call this the stewardship theory. There's the word you want to take from this, the stewardship theory. He believed that the president can do anything that the Constitution doesn't prohibit. So this very broad view of presidential powers. He can act how he wants as long as he doesn't break the law. My belief was that it was not only the president's right, but his duty to do anything that the needs of the nation demanded, unless such action was forbidden by the Constitution are by the laws. So this very robust presidency, and this has been the theory that every president since has followed. This idea of the president not as a steward, but not as not as a background figure, not simply supporting, but rather as an active participant, an active voice, stepping out in government, enforcing his policy. So, Whig theory versus stewardship theory. Under Roosevelt, the other Roosevelt, under the other Roosevelt, we saw another big step forward. The Great Depression hit when Hoover was president, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about economic policy. But basically, Hoover kept a somewhat hands-off approach, which was what was generally believed to be the right thing at the time. But as the Depression got deeper, people wanted the government to be more active. And Roosevelt shared his distant cousin's theory about the presidency as being an active participant in government. So when he came in, he created what we call the New Deal. And he was a very active president. He created a number of new economic programs. But these new programs, these were all executive branch programs. All of these new agencies, Social Security, social welfare agencies, economic regulation, public works, all of these new things that came in, they were in the executive branch, and so directly answerable to him. So we saw this massive explosion in power in the New Deal on what the federal government does. And so we saw the power of the presidency greatly expand. And there really is, you can see a correlation here. Prior to the Great Depression, the states were really in charge of the country because that's where the money was raised and the money was spent. The federal government was much smaller. They didn't have a bunch of social welfare programs. They didn't build a bunch of roads. They didn't handle a bunch of these day-to-day issues that we think of today. Those issues were handled by the states. And who's sort of in charge of the states? Obviously the governors are, but who are the representatives? Well, the House and the Senate, right? In the federal government, it's the House and the Senate who are those liaisons between the state and central government. So prior to the New Deal, prior to these new programs, we saw that the states were in charge. And we saw that because the states were in charge, federal power was vested in those state representatives in the House and the Senate. However, after the New Deal, we saw that power went from the states to Washington. That it was no longer the states handling social welfare, the states handling public works, the states handling regulations, but we saw this massive shift of power to Washington. And who's in Washington? Who's the representative in Washington? Well, the president. And so we saw this massive transfer of power from the states and their representatives in Congress to the president and to Washington, D.C. And so we saw this major change. Now, down at the very bottom, you get to watch a teacher, not me, rap about the New Deal. I am not going to make you watch it, but it is there if you want to see a teacher try desperately to sing cool. Okay, so today, what are we looking at today? Today, the presidency is a very strong office. The presidency has taken over a lot of the state power. The federal government took it over, and the president is in charge of administering it. That gives him a lot of power. The office of the president administers thousands of programs and hundreds of different agencies. Increasingly, as we discussed, the president has taken over Congress's role in making policy decisions. No longer does Congress decide what laws should be made, but the president is deciding. This was very interesting. Eisenhower, when he came in, he didn't have a background in government. He had a background in the military, so he came in and he sat down and he spoke with Congress about what laws needed to be passed, and the House committee chair told him outright that when President Eisenhower took over, he said, "You, President Eisenhower, draft the bills. We work them over." Meaning that by 1953, it had become a system where it is really up to the president what bills become law, It's then up to the House to kind of make changes as they see fit. Also, the growing role of U.S. international affairs increase the power of the president. And this is just a question. Think about, do you agree with the Whig theory, or do you agree with the other theories? Do you believe that the president is an administrator, or should he be able to do anything that's not forbidden? Okay, a couple more things really fast, I promise. Presidential versus parliamentary system. U.S. has the presidential system, which requires coordination between the separate branches, executive and legislative, to get anything done. In most of Europe, they have what's called a parliamentary system. So they take the head of state and separate it from the head of government. So the head of state, and I can't really talk about it more in other classes, other semesters. It's harder to do it online, but the head of state is the ceremonial head. It's the Queen of England. It's the person who shows up and waves, right? Hello. That's the head of state. The head of government is the person who actually oversees the day-to-day affairs of the government. Now, in most of the world, or most of Europe, I won't say most of the world, there's a lot of places that are like what we have, and a lot of places still have an absolute monarch, but most of Europe, they have a parliamentary system. The head of state, the Queen, is separate, and in some places, the president, they'll have an elected president who's the head of state. And these people, their job is to be the ceremonial head of the government. They'll sometimes have veto powers. And they separate that out from the head of government. The head of government is the prime minister. And their job is to oversee the day-to-day affairs of the government and how the government works. And that head of government is a member of the legislature. So these are two very different ways that kind of exist in different countries. And it's kind of fun to think about. Do you think that all of that power should be focused in a head of state, in a president? Or do you think the head of state and head of government should be separated, and we should have more of a more of a parliamentary system, where the parliament, the people who make laws, are also responsible for seeing them carried out? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? And why? Okay. Very quickly on presidential power. When the president first comes into office, he has 100 days to get stuff done. This is sometimes called the honeymoon period. The first 100 days in office is where the president lays out their agenda and tries to get their major key bills, because right then they're riding high. The people just voted them in. The people are like him. The approval numbers are high. Congress, if they're on his side, feel fired up from the recent election. If they're on the other team's side, if they're on the other party's side, they feel, they just lost the presidency. So they're a little bit more willing to go along with it. So the president forces through his main agenda in the first 100 days. If they can't get it done during the first 100 days, it gets harder. If they can't get something done during their first year in office, generally they're not going to get it done. Generally they have, as president, 1 year out of the 4 to try to get legislation done. And after that, they're just sort of managing. By contrast, at the end of the president's term, they have absolutely no power. And the ultimate sort of indignity is what's called the lame duck period, and we're about to see this happen. So the presidential elections take place in November, but the new president doesn't take office until January. So between November and January, how much power does the president have? This is called the lame duck period because they can do absolutely nothing. Now it's going to be very interesting to see. We just had the death of a Supreme Court justice. We're looking at, the president has already said he's planning on appointing a new person, and so we're going to have a question. If the president does not win re-election, is he going to take this lame duck period and attempt to get a Supreme Court justice on the bench during that time period? That's going to be very interesting to watch, and we're going to get to see sort of this issue play out during the course of this course, I guess, right at the end and a little bit after. But it will be interesting to see how this president resolves. If he doesn't win re-election, how will he act during the lame duck period? Is it going to be like most lame duck periods where the president sort of backs off into the background? We saw this very clearly when George W. Bush was at the end of his second term and Obama was coming in. W very much sort of stepped back, and because we were entering into that financial crisis, the Great Recession, as we're calling it now, and he sort of stepped back and let the new president step into the role and worked with him to sort of frame new policies to make an easy transition, because he realized that we are facing a major problem for the U.S. and that we would need that steady hand to guide our ship of state through that period. It'll be very interesting to see if Trump loses re-election. It would be difficult for him to imagine Trump being in a situation where he sort of works with Joe Biden to attempt to make a smooth transition of power, but we'll certainly see what happens. Okay, one final point is that foreign policy is generally considered the domain of the president. Congress generally takes a back seat, including the Senate. The Senate has a role in foreign policy. As we discussed, they approve treaties, but it's really the president's role to be in charge of foreign policy. By contrast, Congress is really sort of takes the lead in domestic policy, though increasingly the president will get involved with that. And as we've talked about several times now, because it is very important to remember, when it comes to military force, the power of the president is virtually unlimited. And that leads us into the end, but one final point, and I just want to bring this up, is the power of the president is virtually unlimited when it comes to military power. So the question I'm going to post this week for you to consider in the discussion board is nuclear weapons. Should the president have the power, the unilateral power, to use nuclear weapons? Believe it or not, right now, the answer is yes. There is no check on the power of the president. Nuclear weapons are in the hands of the military. If the president orders a nuclear strike, the military is obligated to do so. In fact, they choose people specifically. They screen them psychologically, the people in charge of actually pushing the button, to make sure they will push the button. They pick people who they do psychological profiles and find that they are willing to destroy the world if that's the order they're given. And so the president has that unlimited power. The question I'm going to post for you is that how it should work? Do we agree with that? Should the president have the unilateral power, or should there be some check on it? Should there be some sort of system? There was one psychologist who said that how we should handle this is the nuclear codes should be installed in a volunteer's chest cavity next to their heart, and the president should be given a knife. And if the president wants to fire nuclear weapons, he should have to kill the man, cut into his chest to remove the code. And his argument is that it is that serious a choice that the president should have to have blood directly on his hands. And so, other people have proposed that maybe Congress should have a say in it, which might be a slightly more palatable decision. But that's the question I'm going to post for you. I look forward to seeing your answers on, yes, the president should have unlimited power to use those nuclear weapons. No, he shouldn't, and these are the checks we should have in place. So we're going to have one more short video. It's a fun one, I promise, and then we're going to be done.